The gravel crunched beneath my worn boots as I approached the farmhouse I hadn't seen in 5 years. The white paint was peeling worse now, and the front porch sagged slightly under the weight of neglect. My brothers, Marcus and Jake, stood on that same porch, arms crossed, watching me with barely concealed hostility. I'd driven 12 hours straight from the city after receiving the call about Grandpa's funeral. The service was tomorrow, but I knew I needed to face this conversation tonight. My duffel bag felt heavier with each step, weighed down not just by clothes, but by memories and unresolved family tensions. Marcus stepped forward first, his jaw set in that familiar stubborn line. At 32, he was the eldest and had never let any of us forget it. Jake flanked him, 2 years my senior, his calloused hands clenched at his sides. They'd been running the farm together since I left for college, building their lives around this land while I chased dreams in corporate America. "Didn't expect to see you back here so soon," Marcus said, his voice carrying the same cold edge it had when I'd announced my departure. "Thought the city boy was too good for us country folk." I set my bag down on the bottom step, meeting his gaze steadily. The August heat pressed down on us, cicadas singing their evening chorus in the oak trees that bordered the property. This place looked the same, smelled the same, felt the same, but everything between us had changed. "I'm here for Grandpa," I replied simply. "Just like you." But we all knew that wasn't entirely true. There were papers to be read, decisions to be made, and a legacy to be divided. The kitchen hadn't changed since childhood. Same checkered tablecloth, same wooden chairs with their familiar creaks, same smell of coffee that seemed permanently embedded in the walls. Mom had prepared her usual feast despite the circumstances, comfort food to ease the grief that hung over us like morning fog. Jake picked at his mashed potatoes, still avoiding direct eye contact. The silence stretched uncomfortable and thick between us. Dad cleared his throat repeatedly, a nervous habit that had gotten worse since his heart attack 3 years ago. Mom bustled around, refilling glasses that weren't empty, her way of coping with family tension. "So what's the plan?" Marcus finally asked, cutting straight to the bone like he always did. "You staying for the reading of the will, or heading back to your fancy apartment right after the funeral?" I set down my fork carefully. "I'll stay as long as necessary." "Necessary for what?" Jake spoke up for the first time, his voice bitter. "To swoop in and claim your piece of something you walked away from?" The accusation hit exactly where it was meant to. I had walked away. When Grandpa needed an extra pair of hands during harvest season, I was in board meetings. When the drought threatened the corn crop 2 summers ago, I was closing deals in air-conditioned offices. While they sweated and bled for this land, I'd built a different life entirely. "That's not fair," I said quietly. Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Fair? You want to talk about fair? We've been here every day for 5 years, every morning before dawn, every evening after dark. We saved this place when the bank wanted to foreclose." The weight of his words settled over the table. I hadn't known about the foreclosure threat. After dinner, I needed air that wasn't thick with resentment. The barn drew me like it had when I was a boy seeking refuge from household chaos. The familiar smell of hay and old wood enveloped me as I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing in the vast space. Grandpa's workshop occupied the far corner, tools still hanging exactly where he'd left them. His workbench bore the scars of decades of projects, scratches from his saw, burns from his soldering iron, ink stains from the ledgers where he tracked every expense and profit. I ran my fingers along the worn wood, remembering countless afternoons spent here learning to fix what was broken. "He taught me to whittle in this spot," I whispered to the emptiness, touching a particular gouge in the bench's edge. My first attempt at carving had gone badly wrong, the knife slipping and taking a chunk out of the workbench along with my thumb. Grandpa hadn't scolded me for either wound. The old man had been different from Dad, more patient with my questions and dreams. While my father saw only practical applications, Grandpa encouraged my curiosity about the world beyond our fence lines. He'd been the one to suggest college, to push me toward possibilities he'd never had. But he'd also been the one to teach me that land has memory, that soil holds the stories of everyone who's ever worked it. Standing here now, I felt those stories pressing against my consciousness, demanding acknowledgement. A loose floorboard near the workbench caught my attention. It had always been loose, a minor imperfection Grandpa never bothered fixing. Tonight, something about it looked different. Deliberate. Like a secret hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right person to notice at the right moment. My fingers found the loose board's edge easily, muscle memory guiding them to the exact spot I'd absently worried as a child. The wood lifted with barely any pressure, revealing a space I'd never known existed. Inside lay a manila envelope, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. My name was written across the front in Grandpa's distinctive handwriting, the letters formed with the same care he brought to everything he did. My heart hammered against my ribs as I lifted the envelope, noting its weight and thickness. This wasn't just a note, it was something substantial. I carried it outside to the porch swing where Grandpa and I had shared countless conversations about everything from crop rotation to constellation patterns. The moon provided just enough light to read by, and I carefully opened the envelope, half afraid of what I might find. Inside were 3 items: a handwritten letter, a folded legal document, and a small brass key I didn't recognize. I started with the letter, my throat tightening as I saw the date at the top. He'd written it just 2 months ago, shortly after his last visit to the doctor. "My dear grandson," it began, "if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've found what I hoped you would find. This old barn has always been our special place, hasn't it? Where we talked about dreams and possibilities, where I taught you that fixing things requires patience and the right tools." I paused, remembering those lessons. Grandpa never rushed a repair, never forced a solution. He'd taught me to understand the problem before attempting to fix it. The letter continued. "I've been watching this family drift apart, watching old hurts fester like untended wounds. But I've also been planning, because that's what farmers do. We prepare for seasons that haven't come yet." The letter revealed a side of Grandpa I'd never fully understood. Behind his gentle demeanor and patient teaching lay the mind of a strategist, someone who'd been quietly orchestrating events long before any of us realized we were part of his larger plan. "I know your brothers believe I'll leave everything to them," he wrote. "They've earned that expectation through their dedication and sacrifice. But I also know that this farm needs more than dedication to survive the challenges coming ahead. It needs vision, business sense, and connections to a world beyond our county lines." My hands trembled slightly as I read. He'd been watching us all more carefully than we'd known, evaluating our strengths and weaknesses with a farmer's practical eye. "Marcus has the heart of this place, the deep love that keeps him working 18-hour days without complaint. Jake has the hands, the instinctive understanding of how to coax life from reluctant soil. But you, my boy, you have the mind for what comes next. You understand markets and regulations, technology and finance." The legal document was a revised will, dated just weeks before his death. I unfolded it with trembling fingers, scanning the formal language until I found the critical passages. The farm wasn't being divided equally among us. Instead, it was being restructured as a family trust, with specific roles and responsibilities outlined for each brother. Marcus would manage daily operations, Jake would oversee crop production and livestock, and I would handle business development, marketing, and financial planning. But here was the crucial detail. Major decisions required unanimous agreement among all 3 trustees. "The key opens a safety deposit box at First National," the letter continued. "Inside, you'll find the resources to modernize this operation and secure its future. But only if you 3 can learn to work together again." I sat on that porch swing until dawn, reading and rereading Grandpa's letter, trying to absorb the magnitude of what he'd done. He hadn't just left us property, he'd left us a puzzle that could only be solved through cooperation. The old man had been more cunning than any of us realized. The funeral passed in a blur of condolences and casseroles, neighbors and distant relatives, sharing memories of a man who'd quietly influenced more lives than I'd known. Marcus and Jake handled the arrangements with practiced efficiency, while I felt like an outsider observing someone else's grief. But that evening, as relatives departed and the house settled into mournful quiet, I knew the time had come. I found my brothers in the living room sharing a bottle of Dad's bourbon and staring at the empty chair where Grandpa used to hold court. "We need to talk," I said, holding up the envelope. Marcus looked up with weary eyes. "If this is about the will reading tomorrow, we already know what it says. Dad told us years ago that the farm would go to us since we're the ones who stayed." "Actually, you don't know what it says." I sat down across from them, placing the envelope on the coffee table between us. "Grandpa made some changes, recent changes." Jake leaned forward, his expression shifting from exhaustion to wariness. "What kind of changes?" I pulled out the revised will, the legal language suddenly feeling heavy with implication. "He restructured everything as a family trust. All three of us are trustees, with equal decision-making power." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus snatched the document, his eyes scanning the pages with growing disbelief. Jake read over his shoulder, their faces reflecting the same shock I'd felt hours earlier. "This can't be right," Marcus whispered. "He wouldn't do this to us." "Listen to me," I said, pulling out Grandpa's letter. "There's more to this than what's on the legal document." He left an explanation. I read the letter aloud, watching my brothers' faces transform as they understood the depth of Grandpa's planning. When I finished, Jake was the first to speak. "A safety deposit box. What resources is he talking about?" I held up the brass key. "Only one way to find out." Marcus stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the fields he'd been tending for 5 years. "I can't believe he'd tie our hands like this. Unanimous decisions? Do you have any idea how impossible that's going to be?" "Maybe that was the point," I said quietly. "Maybe he knew we needed to learn how to work together again." "Work together?" Marcus spun around, his face flushed with anger. "You haven't been here, remember? You don't get to waltz back in and start making decisions about our lives." Jake set down his glass with deliberate care. "But he's right about one thing. This place has been struggling. The margins keep getting thinner, costs keep going up. We've been working harder just to stay even." Marcus shot him a betrayed look. "Are you taking his side already?" "I'm not taking anyone's side," Jake replied firmly. "I'm stating facts. Remember last spring when the grain elevator changed their pricing structure? We lost $3,000 overnight because we didn't understand the new contract terms. Remember when the organic certification fell through because we missed a filing deadline?" The specific examples hit home. I could see Marcus deflating slightly, his anger giving way to reluctant acknowledgement of their challenges. "Those are exactly the kinds of problems I deal with in my job," I said carefully. "Market analysis, regulatory compliance, contract negotiation." First National Bank hadn't changed much since I was a child. Same marble floors, same teller windows, same hushed atmosphere that made you speak in whispers. The safety deposit box was registered under Grandpa's name, with all three of us listed as authorized accessors. The bank manager, Mrs. Henderson, remembered me from high school. She guided us to the vault with the solemn demeanor appropriate for our circumstances, explaining procedures we barely heard through our collective anxiety about what we might find. The box was larger than I'd expected, about the size of a shoebox, but deeper. Mrs. Henderson left us alone in the small viewing room, and I used Grandpa's key with hands that weren't quite steady. Inside were neat stacks of documentation, property surveys, water rights certificates, mineral rights leases I didn't know existed. But beneath the papers were bundles of cash, more money than any of us had expected. Jake whistled low under his breath. "How much is this?" Marcus asked, his voice barely a whisper. I counted quickly. $50,000, maybe more. But the real treasure was a business plan, handwritten in Grandpa's careful script over what must have been months of work. He'd researched organic certification processes, agritourism possibilities, direct-to-consumer marketing strategies, even renewable energy installations. Every page showed evidence of careful thought and planning. "Look at this," I said, pointing to a section about solar panel installations. He calculated that we could sell excess power back to the grid, generate enough revenue to offset property taxes. Jake leaned in, studying the numbers. "These projections look realistic, conservative even." Marcus remained silent, but I could see him absorbing the information despite his reluctance. The plan addressed every concern they'd raised about the farm's financial struggles, offering concrete solutions rather than vague optimism. We spread Grandpa's business plan across the kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared countless meals and arguments. The scope of his research was staggering. He'd identified 7 different revenue streams that could supplement traditional farming income, each one carefully analyzed for feasibility and return on investment. "He's got yield projections going back 20 years, Jake said, pointing to a chart tracking corn and soybean productivity. "Look at this trend analysis. He predicted last year's drought impact almost exactly." Marcus studied a section about equipment upgrades. "These machinery costs are accurate too. He must have gotten quotes from every dealer in 3 counties. I found myself looking at my grandfather with new respect. The patient man who'd taught me to whittle had been conducting sophisticated business analysis while I was learning similar skills in corporate boardrooms. His methods were different, his tools simpler, but his understanding was profound. "There's a timeline here," I noted, finding a page dated 6 months ago. He planned to implement these changes gradually over 3 years. Phase 1 focuses on organic certification and direct sales. Phase 2 adds agritourism elements. Phase 3 incorporates renewable energy. The plan's genius lay in its recognition of our individual strengths. Marcus's deep knowledge of sustainable farming practices made organic certification achievable. Jake's natural way with people positioned him perfectly for agritourism ventures. My business background was essential for navigating regulations and securing financing. "He really thought this through," Marcus admitted grudgingly, "but implementation is going to be complicated. Some of these ideas require significant upfront investment." "That's what the cash is for," I said. "Seed money for the first phase." Jake looked up from a section about farmers' market participation. "You know what bothers me most about this? He was planning our future while we were just trying to survive each season." The next morning brought our first real test of Grandpa's vision. A representative from Green Valley Organic Foods called, interested in contracting our soybean production for their new product line. The offer was generous but required organic certification within 18 months. "We can't commit to something that ambitious," Marcus argued as we debated the opportunity. "Organic certification is complicated, expensive, and there's no guarantee we'll pass inspection on the first try. But the premium they're offering would increase our profit margins by 40%, I countered, reviewing the contract terms. Even accounting for certification costs and potential yield reductions during transition, we'd come out ahead. Jake sat between us, literally and figuratively. "What does Grandpa's plan say about organic timing?" I flipped through the business plan until I found the relevant section. He projected 18 months for full certification, starting with soil testing and documentation immediately. "See, he knew this opportunity was coming," I said. "That's why he left us the cash cushion and the detailed roadmap." Marcus shook his head stubbornly. "You're talking about completely changing how we've been farming this land for generations. What if it doesn't work? What if we lose everything trying to chase some organic fantasy?" His fear was understandable but frustrating. Every decision felt like a battle between his cautious pragmatism and my aggressive optimism, with Jake trying to find middle ground that satisfied no one completely. "This is exactly why unanimous decisions won't work," Marcus continued. "We're too different. We want different things." "Maybe that's the point," Jake said quietly. "Maybe Grandpa knew we needed to balance each other out. Your caution keeps us from making reckless mistakes. His business sense keeps us from missing opportunities. My practical knowledge keeps us grounded in what actually works." It was the most insightful thing any of us had said since this whole process began. The breakthrough came during a late-night walk through the cornfields. I'd been unable to sleep, wrestling with the complexity of our situation, when I found Jake sitting on the old tractor, staring at the stars. "Mind some company?" I asked. He scooted over, making room on the fender. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of insects and distant highway traffic. The corn rustled around us, tall enough now to form green walls on either side of the equipment row. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier," Jake began, "about balancing each other out. Maybe you're right. Maybe Grandpa was smarter than we gave him credit for." "Marcus is scared," I said, "and he has good reason to be. This place is his whole world. If we fail, he loses everything. But if we don't try, we might lose everything anyway," Jake replied. "The margins keep shrinking. Input costs keep rising. We can't survive long-term doing exactly what we've always done." I studied his profile in the moonlight, seeing Grandpa's features reflected in his jawline and the way he held his shoulders. "What do you think we should do about the organic contract?" "I think we should propose a compromise. Start with 50 acres as a pilot program. That's enough to meet their minimum volume requirements, but not so much that we risk the whole operation." It was a brilliant solution, typical of Jake's practical wisdom. Conservative enough to address Marcus's concerns, ambitious enough to test the concept's viability. "Would you be willing to lead the organic transition?" I asked. "Handle the day-to-day management while Marcus focuses on the conventional acreage?" If Marcus agrees to the pilot program, yes. But we need to present this as a unified recommendation, not another argument between you two. The next evening, I cooked dinner for my brothers. It seemed like a small gesture, but I wanted to demonstrate that I was committed to being here, not just visiting temporarily. I made Grandpa's favorite meal, pot roast with vegetables, biscuits from scratch, and apple pie using fruit from our own trees. Marcus seemed surprised by the effort. "I didn't know you could cook." "Grandpa taught me," I said, setting plates around the familiar table. "Same way he taught me to fix engines and balance ledgers. Said a man should be able to take care of himself." We ate in relative peace, the first meal we'd shared without tension since I'd returned. When we finished, I pulled out the organic contract and Jake's compromise proposal. "Before you say no," I began, "just hear us out completely." I explained the pilot program concept, emphasizing the limited risk and potential for learning. Jake added technical details about soil preparation and certification requirements. Together, we presented a unified front for the first time in years. Marcus listened without interrupting, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but not immediately rejecting the idea. When we finished, he sat quietly for several minutes, thinking. 50 acres, he said finally. "And if the pilot fails, we don't expand organic operations." "Agreed," Jake and I said simultaneously. "And I want oversight of the financial projections. No surprise expenses." "Absolutely," I nodded. "Complete transparency on all costs and revenues." Marcus looked around the table, seeing us really looking at him rather than past him. "All right, we'll try the pilot program, but we do this carefully, methodically, exactly the way Grandpa would have done it." I felt something release in my chest, a tension I'd been carrying for years without realizing it. "Thank you, Marcus. I know this isn't easy." "None of this is easy," he replied. "But maybe that's not the point. 3 weeks later, I found myself knee-deep in soil samples and certification paperwork, learning aspects of farming I'd never considered during my childhood here. The organic transition required documentation of every input, every practice, every decision affecting the designated 50 acres. It was exactly the kind of detailed record-keeping that appealed to my business-trained mind. Jake proved to be an invaluable teacher, explaining the subtle relationships between soil chemistry, weather patterns, and crop health. His knowledge went far deeper than I'd realized, encompassing not just what to do, but why each practice mattered. "See this soil test?" he said, pointing to numbers on a lab report. "The pH is right on the edge of acceptable for organic soybeans. We'll need to add lime, but we can't use the conventional stuff anymore. Organic lime costs twice as much but releases nutrients more slowly." Marcus, meanwhile, had thrown himself into researching organic pest management with the same intensity he brought to everything else. He'd connected with other organic farmers, attended extension service workshops, and compiled a reference library that rivaled any agricultural college's resources. "Beneficial insects are key," he explained during one of our evening planning sessions. "Instead of spraying to kill pests, we create habitat for insects that eat pests. It's more complex but more sustainable long-term." The transformation in our family dynamics was gradual but unmistakable. We were talking again, really talking, about shared goals instead of individual grievances. The farm provided common ground in the most literal sense. I found myself staying longer than originally planned, taking remote work meetings from the front porch, and conducting conference calls from Grandpa's workshop. The city apartment that had defined my identity for 5 years began to feel less like home than this place I'd thought I'd outgrown. 6 months after Grandpa's funeral, we gathered again around the kitchen table, this time to review our first quarterly report as a family trust. The pilot organic program showed promising early results. Direct sales at farmers' markets had exceeded projections. Most importantly, we'd learned to work together without bloodshed. "The bank called yesterday," Marcus said, reviewing financial statements. "They want to feature our transition in their agricultural newsletter. Apparently, we're becoming a model for sustainable family farming." Jake laughed. "Grandpa would get a kick out of that. He always said the best plans are the ones nobody notices until they're already working." I'd made my own transition official the week before, giving notice to my firm and accepting a consulting contract that would let me work primarily from the farm. The decision surprised everyone, including myself, but it felt inevitable once I stopped fighting it. "I've been thinking about Grandpa's letter," I said, pulling out the worn pages I'd read countless times. "About how he said land has memory, that soil holds the stories of everyone who's worked it." "What about it?" Marcus asked. "I think we're adding our own chapter now. The 3 of us, working together instead of separately. Maybe that's what he really wanted. Not just to save the farm, but to save us as brothers." We sat in comfortable silence, looking out the window at fields that were both exactly the same and completely different than when I'd returned. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across rows of corn and soybeans, some destined for conventional markets, some for organic buyers who paid premium prices for sustainably grown crops. Thank you for listening to our story. It's been quite a journey from that first difficult dinner to where we are today. I hope you enjoyed following along as we learned to honor both tradition and change, to balance individual dreams with family responsibilities. Please let us know in the comments where you're listening from, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories about family, farming, and finding your way home.